Hello, and welcome to What's Your Win Rate? The Cautionary Tale of Adrian, who slayed the spire. I have been asked many times on my channel what my win rate is at Slay the Spire, and it is a challenging question to give an answer to. It's a more loaded question than people realize within the community, and it's also a question that I myself um, don't really know how to answer. I'm not sure what you mean, and even if you tell me what you do mean, I'm not necessarily sure what the answer is in the moment or ever. So I want to tell you a story and hopefully explain to you how I feel about win rates inside the Spire. First of all, though, the simplest approach to telling you what my win rate is to use descriptive statistics. I can interpret your question just to mean how many runs have I won over some sort of time period compared to how many I've played in that time period. So if you said, what is your win rate over the last month? I could look that up and I could tell you. As long as we are clear on what time period it's spoken about, this is generally simple enough to answer. It's just a matter of looking it up. However, statistics like this aren't generally going to be able to be attached to a claim that a win rate like this will continue. So I'm 1 and 9 over the last 2 days, and I just went 27 and 3 this week, are both statements I've made in the last month, but obviously the 10% from the first example didn't continue, and the 90% from the second can't be expected to either. I don't think it will. I think it would be astronomically flabbergasting if it did. So I can tell you those things, but we have to understand that when I tell you those things, I am not talking about what is my ability to win at Slay the Spire in the abstract. I am simply telling you over the last time period, this is how many runs I won. How many I win over the next time period might be completely different for any number of reasons, many of which we'll talk about in this presentation. You might think, well, wait a second. What if I really, for real though, wanted to know what percentage of runs you won? Couldn't you just play lots and lots and lots of runs to a point where all of that stuff gets to a point where it kind of just all averages out? So yeah, you win 10% for a couple days and you win 90% for a week. But overall, if we look at like 3 months worth of your play or something like that, all of that would average out. And in the end, you'd get what your actual chance to win a run is. It sounds like an appealing thought, right? It would be useful to be able to tell what this information was. It could be useful from a competitive standpoint. It also would be useful for us getting better at Slay the Spire. If we could very confidently say, well, the way that I'm playing right now has an 81% chance to win, and the way that I played a couple of months ago had a 79% chance to win, so this way is better, that would make it much easier for us to improve Slay the Spire if we could reliably and consistently do that. So, with that thought, we reached the largest statistical refutation I've ever seen in the real world. One Slay the Spire player was very confident that they could do this and spent years playing characters to establish his win rate. Adrian believed he had proven that his win rates averaged across all 4 characters were 80% overall. He even liked to share his opinion about what other people's win rates were by extremely loosely applying the same sort of logic to their results, and disparaged other players who didn't try to prove their win rates these ways. His goal in much of his play in Slay the Spire was to play lots and lots of runs so that he could say, this is what my win rate is. And he thought that other people should also do that. And if other people didn't do that, he thought they had little value. He thought they were playing wrong. However, when Adrian tried to play all 4 characters at once, saying that he had an 80% win rate, He won 77 out of 121 runs before giving up, and this is only 63.6% of his runs. If his win rates were what he claimed, this should statistically only happen 1 in about 5,000 times. There's an asterisk here because Adrian didn't actually rotate through the characters like he said he was going to exactly. He played some of them more than others, and because of that, his expected win rate based on his prior belief of his win rates was slightly lower. But that's why it's only 5,000. If it were actually 80%, it would be a less likely occurrence. I've already adjusted for that. I'm just letting you know in case you do the math on this and you're like, wait a second, my math doesn't match. So why did this happen? Can we think of any reasons? Yes, I can. I have studied statistics. So I've got a few problems here with what Adrian did. And problem one is we have to think about which runs Adrian was using as data. Because Adrian wasn't doing the thing that we just said where you could play lots and lots and lots of runs and eventually end up with what your win rate was. Instead of looking at all of his runs to decide his win rates, Adrian looked at sets of 50 or 100 runs, thinking that such sets would be large enough to be reliable evidence for his win rate, but he did something massively wrong in selecting these runs, discarded sets of runs in which he did poorly. Instead of using the runs that he did poorly in as important data on his limitations, he thought that they were unimportant and that he would keep learning to surpass those performances. Basically, he thought he hadn't quite worked out the character yet, or he was in a bad mood, so this shouldn't count, or something like that. And so he discarded the data. But by doing this, he muted the power of the number of runs he was playing to actually reduce variance. In fact, the number of runs he played, by nature of how he was playing them, instead increased variance in the direction of inflating his win rate. Well, it increased the average in the direction of inflating his win rate. It decreased variance, I guess. But yeah, anyway, I'll show you. What happens if you repeat an experiment but only care about the best result? Well, what happens is you make the experiment less likely to give you a true answer. So if we flip a coin 50 times, on average, it comes up heads 25 times, half the times, right? It has a standard deviation of plus or minus 3.5 times. Standard deviation is a term from statistics that tries to describe normal variations in results. So the average male height might be 5'10" plus or minus 3 inches. That doesn't mean that everyone who is male is between 5'7" and 6'1". In fact, I don't even know if that's what the standard deviation is for males or whatever. I just made this up completely. But what it's trying to say is like the average man might be 5'10" tall, and the deviation isn't like 2 feet. You don't, with extreme regularity, see men who are 3'10" or 7'10". That's actually very unusual. Standard deviation is more like 3 inches. You, with regularity, see men who are between, or maybe like 4 inches or 5 inches. And you regularly see men who are between 5'6" and 6'2". Who knows? Again, I'm making this up. I'm not saying this is actually the distribution of the height of males. This just seemed like a real world example that you could kind of attach to and think, oh yeah, okay. That's what standard deviation is trying to say. So normally we're going to see a result between 21, and 29 if we do this experiment, which means it's not perfect. If we're trying to work out how likely the coin is to come up heads, well, it should be 50%. But if we get 21, we'll be like, well, it looks like it's about 42% maybe, which is, you know, misleading us a little bit, but it's not awful. We're very unlikely to come away from this experiment thinking that it's 60%, for example. Would be very unlikely to think that it was coming up heads 60%. That's outside the range of standard deviation, or at least somewhat unlikely. But let's say that we flip a coin 50 times and it comes up heads 25 times, and then we're like, well, I think it can probably come up heads more than that, so I'm going to do it again. And then we do it again, and it comes up heads, say 24 times, and we're like, well, I think it can come up heads more than that, so I'm going to do it again. And we flip it 50 times, and it comes up heads 27 times this time, and we're like, now that's more like it. I think maybe it could even go a little bit higher, though, and we flip it 50 times again, and it comes up 28 times this time, and we're like, yeah, now we're talking. I think it comes up heads, 56% of the time or so. Well, what we've done with that experiment is we've made it so that our result is biased and wrong. Instead of our experiment averaging a result of 50%, plus or minus 7%, our experiment now is going to average a result of 29.5 heads, which is 60% just about. It's 59%, right? But, almost 60%. With standard deviation of plus or minus 2.27. So that's another 4.5% potentially. So you would regularly, if you did this, come away with the idea that your coin came up heads 62% of the time, which is wrong. Also, the standard deviation is not enough to get you back down to 50% almost ever. The standard deviation is low enough here that you are very, very, very consistently over predicting how often the coin will come up heads. And you can see that actually, let's say that you're playing 100 runs of Slay the Spire to see what your win rate is. The more times that you do that, if you're discarding previous sets and only taking the most recent one until you get a result that you're happy with, the worse and worse and worse and worse this effect gets. If you play 300 runs on a character, 3 sets of 100, on average, if your win rate was 50%, you would end up thinking that your win rate was 54%. And the standard deviation is 3.74. So you're already at a point where you're very unlikely to get your actual true answer at that point. And as you repeat, this just gets worse and worse and worse. So this is problem number 1 with what Adrian was doing, was that he was repeating an experiment in a way which was extremely predictably and reliably overestimating what his win rate was on characters. Problem 2. It's challenging to extrapolate inferential statistics to other populations. What Adrian was trying to do is called inferential statistics. The purpose of inferential statistics is to look at a sample of some data and then say something about the population which the data came from. And what he thought he could do, what he was trying to do, was look at a sample of 50 or 100 of his runs and say something about the full population of all of his runs. He was trying to say, out of all of my runs, I should have an 80% win rate averaged across the 4 characters. But what he was actually doing, instead of successfully doing that, was looking at a full population of 50 or 100 of his runs, and then he was trying to extrapolate data about that full population of 50 or 100 runs to the population of all of his runs. I want to explain the difference to you by giving an example from voter polling. The famous example in statistics of the importance of simple random samples actually comes from the Gallup poll, which you probably have heard of. It's a famous polling company or whatever, which is still operational in the world. It's one of the more famous ones, I would say. So, suppose you want to find out who voters intend to vote for in an upcoming election. This is an important question. It's one of the reasons that we do statistics. Like, that is a thing that you will regularly see in statistics, is people polling voters to see who they'll vote for in an upcoming election, right? That's a very, very, very common way that people see statistics in the news or whatever. A powerful way to discover an answer about the full population of voters is to take a simple random sample of voters. And what that means is that each voter in the population has the same likelihood to be chosen. That's what simple random sample means, basically. So suppose there's a 50% chance of voters voting for one candidate. Like 50% of the voters in the population vote for that candidate. If you successfully take a simple random sample of 100 voters On average, you'll find that 50% of voters intend to vote for that candidate, plus or minus 5%. On average, somewhere between 45 and 50 of the voters that you have in your simple random sample will want to vote for that candidate. And I want to point out, this is the exact same math as the coin flip math. Here it is. We're repeating 0 times here. On average, we'll get 50 plus or minus 5. Because basically what we're doing is a coin flip. We are selecting fairly from a population of the full population of voters, one voter at a time, and 50% of those voters want to vote for that candidate. So there you go. But Adrian didn't actually take a simple random sample of his runs, like the population of all of his runs. And in fairness, if you think about it for a bit, it's confusing to even imagine like what that could mean. So all of the runs that he's played so far, he just like already has them on his hard drive. So he doesn't need to take a sample of those because he can just look at the data in them. He could just like put it all into a spreadsheet or something like that, or just use the run history within Slay the Spire and see how many he had won and how many he had lost, and try to use that to imply what his win rate was. But he's trying to predict what his win rate will be in the future. He's trying to say right now, this is what my win rate is. So the next run I play, this is the chance that I will win the next run, which means he's actually trying to say things about the population of future runs, and the population of future runs doesn't even exist yet. It's not a current material thing in the real world. It's this hypothetical thing that might come to be. And I mean, this is very messy. This doesn't work very well, what he's trying to do. What he did was more like asking the next 100 people you see who they intend to vote for. This is a common and I think easily understandable way that people can see how not taking a simple random sample can give you very, very misleading data in polling. You won't accurately get information on the full population of voters if, for example, you go to a shopping mall and ask 100 people there who they're going to vote for, or you go to a college and ask 100 people there who they're going to vote for, or you go to a retirement home and ask 100 people there who they are going to vote for. Depending on which sorts of people you're asking, you're going to get people saying that they want to vote for a different candidate. And so your sampling method failing to give you a simple random sample is completely removing the power of statistics to give you accurate information about the population that you're trying to learn about. So why does this matter for something like Slay the Spire, though? Well, players don't stay the same. We often get better or worse. So my last 100 runs do not necessarily have much prediction power over my next 100 runs. Many things could change between my last 100 runs and my next 100 runs, assuming my next 100 runs even ever get played. I could try a new strategy, and I could be worse while I learn it, and perhaps eventually I would abandon it, but maybe I'd get better as I learned how to execute it. I could realize something new about one of the cards and use it to increase my win rate substantially. I could change which character I was most focused on, increase my win rate on that character while my win rates on others lowered due to my reduced attention paid to them. And that's why I can't necessarily extrapolate from previous runs to know with much certainty what will happen in future runs. So Adrian was trying to do that, which isn't something that you can necessarily do. Problem 3. Adrian himself wasn't always the same. Adrian was a human, and humans change. So unlike a coin, which lands on heads 50% of the time, a human might win a run of Slay the Spire 80% of the time one day, but 70% of the time the next day. All sorts of factors could influence Adrian's ability to win at Slay the Spire. His mood, his sleep, how much time he had to play the run, whether he was distracted by something, whether he was playing his favorite character or not. So the sets of runs Adrian chose to argue that he had 80% average win rate were played under quite good conditions, but these runs that he played now were not. Here are some examples of differences in conditions. You could have played practice runs on a character before and versus you could have no practice on the character recently. You could spend 6 or so hours per win versus you could be aiming to sometimes win runs in an hour or less, spending massively different amounts of time on your run. You could be trying to rotate through all the characters like Adrian was this time versus focusing on one character at a time, like he had been previously. Also, possibly something could happen like you could lose a few times and then get emotionally involved in that and have snowballing frustration at your losses, where the frustration then leads to you having more losses. Whereas if things are going well for you, you might have snowballing satisfaction at your wins. The mental element of a game like Slay the Spire is a pretty big deal, and sometimes one loss can lead to another loss because you're in a bad mood from the first loss. This is called tilt often in gaming circles. And if you are repeatedly taking sets of runs until you get one where you think, oh yeah, that's a high enough number, that seems right, probably you're going to end up on a set of runs where things went right and you had snowballing satisfaction. And so your opinion of your win rate is going to ignore the idea that sometimes you have snowballing frustration. It's not going to be sensitive to that and accurately capture it. There's a note here that I think is like salient and important. The fact that differences in conditions can massively change someone's chance to win a run of Slay the Spire makes the idea of talking about someone's win rate at Slay the Spire in a vacuum quite silly to begin with. It's just kind of silly to say I have an 80% win rate at Slay the Spire. It doesn't mean very much. Problem number 4, researcher bias. I want to say, by the way, it actually can mean something very, very clear and easily understandable. It can mean that you have won 80% of your Slay the Spire runs so far. Arguably, that is what it usually means when somebody says that about something, but that wasn't the case here with what Adrian was saying. Problem number 4, researcher bias. Big deal in statistics. Researcher bias is well studied. It is something we worry about enough that we often conduct what are called double-blind medical trials, where the doctors don't even know which patients are being given treatment. So like a blind medical trial would mean that the patients didn't know if they were being given treatment or a placebo. To make sure that their knowledge of the fact that they were or were not being given treatment didn't change something like whether they adhered to the treatment or the placebo effect is a big mess and has been studied for something like 40 or 50 years. But just being given a placebo, just understanding that you are being treated in some way can change the result of a medical trial. So that's what a blind medical trial is. And then even after blind medical trials, like after we established that that was a good idea from a statistical perspective, we realized the doctors knowing which patients were getting the treatment was actually affecting the result of the trial. Even if the doctors were not biased in any way, they still had like subconscious bias going on as doctors, which required that we have medical trials where the doctors didn't know either. So when you're collecting statistics, bias is a really big deal, something that we understand in the field of statistics. You have to try very hard to avoid. But Adrian had extremely obvious biases. Adrian liked to say he was better than other Slay the Spire players. Much of the reason he leaned on statistics seemed to be to say that. He also obviously had very little integrity or good faith in comparing himself to others. He would bully other players, call them names, and make up statistics about them, which made him seem better than them. Given this intent, even if he had had a comprehensive understanding of statistics that he was talking about, there's little reason to think that he would have arrived at sensible conclusions. Like, we know in the field of statistics that a researcher who is unbiased already cannot reliably arrive at a sensible conclusion if they have full knowledge of what's going on in the trial. They will accidentally tweak and pull it in different ways, which can be concerning, and like this is bad methodology. But Adrian very, very clearly was, to put it in the most positive way possible, very interested in self-advocating. And people who are interested in self-advocating are very bad at performing statistical trials on themselves. The result of all of these statistical mistakes was the strongest statistical refutation I've ever seen in strategy gaming. After claiming that he had an 80% win rate rotating on characters, Adrian played 121 runs rotating and won 77 of them. So what you're looking at here is a distribution of how many runs someone with 78% win rate on the characters is expected to win, because Adrian played the characters he was worse at more. So I adjusted the win rate down a little bit. This is how likely on the y-axis each of these results is to occur. So a 95 you see is around about 0.08. That means a 95 would occur about 8% of the time. 77, you'll notice, does not have a visible bar on it. And the chance of Adrian winning 77 or fewer runs of Slay the Spire over 121, if what he was saying about himself were true, is 0.00023. That's the probability. As a percentage, that's 0.02%. So, what's the takeaway? Can we just not say anything about our win rates then? Are you being a bit of a wet blanket, Jorbs? Not at all. It's very easy for us to talk descriptively about our win rates, like I showed at the start of the presentation. For example, I can say I have won 93 out of my last 121 runs. Straightforward. But as players, I would argue that we intuitively understand how difficult it is to predict how likely we are to win the next round we play. We know that sometimes we make mistakes and sometimes we don't, but it's hard for us to predict whether or not we will. We know that we're not certain that new strategies we're trying are good, and suspect that some strategies we've been relying on for a while aren't as good as we first thought. It's easy for us to recognize that we're not sure what will happen in our next run, let alone our next 100. Given this, it seems kind of silly for us to be trying to say that we're very confident about what our win rates are. We can also, on top of describing our win rates descriptively, have opinions about our win rates. And here I'm not talking about descriptive win rate, like what I won over my last 121 runs. Here I am talking about abstract win rate, like how much I will win in good conditions if I play another 100 runs. I can think I have an 80% chance to win an Ironclad with the current approach I'm using. In fact, it is necessary for me to be able to think that, because to choose the current approach that I am using, I need to be able to say I think this approach has a higher chance to win than my other options. That is why, as someone pursuing a win in Slay the Spire, I choose one thing over another thing, that it has a higher chance to win, that I believe it has a higher chance to win. However, I can't expect others to agree with my opinion of my win rate. In fact, it doesn't even serve me particularly well to treat it as anything more than an opinion. It's better for me if I don't find it difficult to say, actually, I'd like to rethink this. It seems like this strategy is worse than I thought. It's also better for our community if the win rates of different strategies aren't attached to our egos. For example, let's say boss swapping on Watcher. Somebody thinks that boss swapping on Watcher is very good, and another person thinks it isn't as good. It's important that people can detach that from ego in order to adopt the strategy that is actually better faster, assuming that we care about winning as much as possible inside the Spire. There are other things to care about too, of course. The game is, at its core, about having fun. We can even compete over win rates. There is nothing wrong with competing over win rates. There's nothing wrong with competing to have a higher win rate than another player over some set of runs. However, Given the conditions can greatly change our win rates, it would be weird, and is weird, to try to compare your win rate over a set of runs to the win rate of other players who are playing in a different way from you. I think that that is pretty straightforward and obvious. I'll also say, like, with competition, it is generally kind of impolite to compete with someone who isn't competing with you. It would be weird to go to a track where someone was jogging and try to run around the track just a bit faster than them and then tell everyone that you ran faster than them, right? That would be a very strange thing to do. And when competing in Slay the Spire, I think it is probably important to make sure that we try not to do that. That's the entire presentation. That's really it. I I hope my cautionary tale about win rates was clear. And if you're here because you asked me what my win rate was, I hope I have answered you in a more useful way than something else I could have said.